The woes of a wedding. With another year came another looming social season. The spring flowers were beginning to bloom in Her Majesty's capital, and the aristocrats were abandoning their country manners in droves to take up position in their London townhouses. Though it was still too early for lavish evening parties, those who had spent some time away from the city were making their presence known through their attendance at plays and concerts. That evening, an Irish harp concert was taking place in a luxury hotel. The hall that served as the waiting room was filled with the lively laughter of girls in gorgeous gowns. Among them were those preparing for their debuts this year, their eyes darting this way and that as they seemed ready to flee at a moment's notice. Until this point in their lives, they had been carefully brought up away from society at large, but from now on, they would be expected to search for a marriage partner at these bustling events. That said, they couldn't simply talk to any gentleman who caught their eye, and without being introduced by a parent or older relative, it was difficult even to make their interest known. This had the effect of them only becoming acquainted with men already approved by their parents. Nevertheless, their hearts were fit to burst with the hope that a wonderful gentleman might just fall in love with them at first sight and approach them of his own volition. "Look, there's Lord Ashenbert." The girl's whispers gained an air of exhilaration as a strikingly handsome man entered the hall. He gave a rather mysterious impression, not least because of his title and background. He held the curious position of the Earl of Iberzel, having returned to Britain after growing up abroad to claim the title, which had lain dormant for 300 years. Add to that a head of dazzling blonde hair and an elegance that permeated every word and action, and there were few people he failed to charm, few heads he failed to turn, no matter where he was or what he was doing. The girls stared at him, hoping he might offer them a smile if only they could momentarily catch his eye. That was all they could do, spend the short few moments before he passed them by fantasizing about his eyes meeting theirs and his heart immediately being captured. But they would come out the other side of it having learned that fantasies rarely translated into reality. "I heard that his lordship is soon to be engaged. Would you happen to know anything about that?" "No more than you, I'm afraid. It might be nothing more than a rumor. Nonsense spread by the tabloids." My dear aunt heard it from an acquaintance of hers. Apparently, Lord Ashenbert ordered a dearest necklace from a Bond Street jeweler. Goodness. The girls sighed, slightly disappointed and jealous of the young woman who had been chosen by the man of their dreams. Their envy was quickly overwhelmed by curiosity, however. "I didn't realize that his lordship was already courting somebody. Perhaps it is that songstress. You remember the rumors, don't you? I cannot believe that she will be the one to marry his lordship. The banker's daughter is a much more likely candidate if you ask me. I hear that she is already betrothed to another gentleman. Besides, if this talk of his lordship's engagement is true, then I am certain he will be marrying a noble girl." "I suppose you're right. I wonder who she might be." Apparently, the necklace was to be inscribed with the initials LC. I dare say they belong to the girl in question. "I bet she's incredibly beautiful." As with any such marriage, it will be her standing rather than her looks that matter. And she must come from quite the impressive family to be united with the philandering Lord Ashenbert. The girls' gazes were still stuck on the distant Earl, who was surrounded by noblewomen. "It's me." The quiet statement came from one of the girls sitting at the edge of the group. "I am his lordship's fiancée." "Why, Lady Constable. Do you mean that? When did you make his lordship's acquaintance?" "At a New Year's party," replied the girl, Lucinda Constable. "You are his fiancée? That can't be right. You aren't." Though the other girl trailed off, Lucinda merely smiled graciously. She knew very well what had just gone unspoken. Her mother was a commoner. She was unsuited to marrying someone like Lord Ashenbert, whose name held particular prestige among Britain's earls. His lordship said there is no shame in my mother's union. That it is a legitimate marriage regardless of my parents' different stations. We have been writing to each other since the party, and I recently accepted his proposal. Her friends were dumbfounded, and Lucinda was beyond elated to be at the center of so many questioning faces. She did indeed have the initials LC. She waited for that fact to permeate the other girls' minds, then added humbly, "We have yet to make an official announcement. I hadn't expected the rumor to be picked up through the jewelers. May I ask that you keep it to yourselves for the time being?" Any girl who dreamed of marriage was wont to fantasize about all sorts of things, even long before her husband was decided on. For example, a traditional white wedding dress paired with an orange bouquet, inspired by the wedding of Her Majesty the Queen. Or perhaps gillyflowers, which symbolized eternal love. It was said that by adding something blue, a bride would be blessed with happiness, so it was best to tie a blue ribbon around her garter. She would then walk up the aisle, followed by a long train embroidered with plenty of lace. The reception would be held at the finest restaurant. The couple would travel to Paris, the City of Light, for their honeymoon, just as the bride had always dreamed. Naturally, the groom played a pivotal role in realizing these ideals. He therefore had to be appropriately wealthy and important. It was not uncommon for a well-to-do girl to have a firm plan for her wedding and future lifestyle in mind by the time of her debut. After all, she would have been educated daily in how to be a good wife for as long as she could remember. Meanwhile, Lydia struggled to conjure up a clear picture of what marriage meant in her own mind. It had been 3 weeks since she had decided she would marry. Her desire to be by her partner's side was genuine, but it was still too soon for her to come to terms with the fact that she would become his wife. As a girl who was only just engaged, there should have been nothing more exhilarating than this period of preparation. However, the only emotion Lydia could muster was confusion. Ask her what sort of wedding she wanted, and her mind would come back with nothing. After all, until very recently, she had assumed that marriage was more or less an impossibility for her. If by some miracle, she did find herself a groom, it would be something that happened far in the future, beyond the scope of her imagination. While these vague thoughts floated through her mind, her fiancé was smiling at her. He was Lord Edgar Ashenbert, the master of this mansion situated in Mayfair, London. "What are your thoughts on this dress, Lydia? I think it would suit you. It is suitably modest." His jewel-like, ash-mauve eyes simmered as he gazed at her. The pair was in a small reception room equipped with exquisite furnishings. The Persian rug at their feet, the lavishly designed ceiling, the stately oil paintings on the wall, and the velvet curtains framing the window did nothing but enhance the Earl's elegance, and he suited his surroundings perfectly. Exactly how Lydia had managed to find herself a fiancé of such caliber remained a mystery. Simply gazing at the tall piles of fashion plates and illustrations on the table was enough to exhaust her, but Edgar seemed to be enjoying himself as he picked one out to show her. Neither she nor her father had any idea where or how to begin with the preparations, so she was grateful that the Earl was overseeing their steady progress. Yes, it's lovely, but she had to wonder how much all that lace would cost. Too plain. You would like something slightly more elaborate, yes? Perhaps you would prefer this one. See these embroidered flowers made from pearls? Pearls. A common girl had no business wearing such a dress. The Carltons would never be able to afford it in any case. "I am hardly beautiful enough to wear something like that," Lydia said, casting a nervous glance at her father, who was sitting beside her. "Come now, that's nonsense. Wouldn't you agree, Professor Carlton? Lydia, you are gorgeous enough to wear the finest dress and have it simply enhance your beauty. You ought to have more confidence in yourself. Professor Carlton?" "Sorry. Oh, of course." Lydia's father had fumbled his response, and it was quite clear that he was rather nervous. Perhaps he was beginning to regret giving his permission for their union so readily. The pair had recently visited their associate, a duchess by the name of Masefield, to ask her opinion on what preparations Lydia should make before marrying into a noble house. Lydia had lost her mother when she was very young, and her grandmother had followed a few years ago, so she had no older female relatives to discuss such things with. Meanwhile, her father was as hopeless as could be when it came to the subject of weddings. The Duchess knew Edgar well and had been happy to advise. One of the first things she had emphasized was that Lydia should not hesitate to rely on the Earl. Meanwhile, Professor Carlton's spirits seemed to drop when Masefield politely told him how expensive the dowry and trousseau tended to be to marry into such a prestigious house. Apparently, the numbers were even greater than he had anticipated. Consequently, Lydia was thrust into the reality of it all without having the time for fantasies. "My lord," her father said quickly, "that single dress is as expensive as the entire trousseau for a middle-class wedding." At that, Edgar's attention was finally drawn to the professor's financial concerns. "Please rest assured, Professor, that you needn't concern yourself with the trousseau. I shall take care of the dress, and accessories, and so forth. I ask that you instead focus your attention on Miss Carlton's essentials. Her Grace did mention your lordship's very kind intentions to us, but as Lydia's father, while I understand that it is considered uncouth to interfere in financial matters, I trusted that you would be able to consider the situation from a rational perspective." Lydia's father was not one to overly concern himself with social etiquette. As an academic, his mind worked on the tenets of logic. It wasn't so much that he would feel shame in allowing the groom to take over the wedding preparations, but rather that he knew he wouldn't have done so had Lydia's mother still been alive. "I wonder whether your lordship might at least allow me to prepare the wedding dress, if nothing else. As for the rest of it, I shall add what I can to the dowry, although it will only be a paltry amount." Edgar's stance was that Lydia should be dressed to the nines, as befitted a young woman about to become a countess. However, he chose not to turn down the professor's suggestion. "Very well. Then I shall take care of the items that will be required after the wedding." A trousseau included everything from table runners to linens. In short, it comprised items required in everyday life. It also included new clothing, shoes, hats, accessories, and cosmetics, which the bride would need for her new position. However, what a commoner might perceive as high quality and worthy for the trousseau was unlikely to be fit for a countess. Not only were the dresses and jewels appropriate for noble society beyond an ordinary man's reach, but Edgar's home was already equipped with luxury cloth and tableware. It seemed that the Carltons would be responsible only for the wedding dress and minor essentials, just as Masefield had advised. The butler arrived then to inform Edgar that he had a visitor. Once the Earl had left the room, Lydia's father let out a weary sigh. He removed his spectacles and wiped them with his jacket sleeve. Lydia liked how unassuming he was in that way, even if it made him a touch slovenly. She liked his unkempt hair, his tattered shirt, and his pockets, bulging with pebbles he'd picked up just as a child would. That was why, as she gazed at him, she wondered whether the wedding preparations were moving along a little too quickly. Her father had seemed desperately forlorn ever since she had agreed to marry Edgar, and she was feeling slightly down about it herself. She had accepted the Earl's proposal because she wanted to be with him. The fact that she would have to leave her father to do so hadn't crossed her mind at the time. Nor had she known that a marriage across classes would be quite so finicky. "I'm sorry, father." The professor turned to her and studied her intently for a moment before his eyes softened and his lips spread into a smile. "You've nothing to apologize for. You mustn't look so glum." "Yes, father. You are mistaken if you think that I am unhappy. His lordship is being very considerate of you." The latter point had not gone unnoticed by Lydia. Edgar had foreseen the potential issues in arranging their union, which was why he had asked the Duchess to be there for his fiancée and hadn't made any assumptions about what her father would provide. That said, the Carltons were relatively wealthy in the context of their rural hometown. Though the professor was wont to spend careless sums of money in pursuit of his research, they lived comfortably, if without extravagance. Moreover, he had properly set aside the funds required for his daughter's wedding. Had she been marrying within her station, she was certain that her father would have been able to manage the preparations without any sense of inferiority. The guilt made it difficult for her to feel excitement about the wedding. Lydia lowered her head. Her father put a hand on her shoulder. "If his lordship is offering you dresses and accessories, you must allow him to indulge you as much as possible. It's incredibly important at this stage. As the years go by, you might find your husband is not as keen to dress you up as he once was," he said, forcing himself to sound cheerful. "Goodness. Was that the case for you too, father? For your mother? She put in an awful lot of effort at the beginning to sort out my appearance. It took about a year for her to give up. At last, Lydia was able to manage a small smile. The private happenings of the flourishing upper classes were of great interest even to London's common citizenry. Lord Ashenbert had appeared in tabloids time and time again due to his philandering ways, and once the rumours about his recent engagement started, the tabloids were filled with exaggerated conjecture surrounding his fiancée's identity. Lydia wasn't sure how she ought to feel about the fact that she hadn't once been named as a potential candidate. That said, she supposed she shouldn't have expected differently. She wasn't from noble stock, nor was she particularly beautiful. Her dull, russet hair had forever been described as rust-colored behind her back, and people seemed to consider her yellow-green eyes witch-like and disturbing. It wasn't just their color that gave such an impression, but the fact that they could perceive fairies, creatures that were invisible to the average person. Britain had always been home to humans who could see and communicate with fairies. The Fae were everywhere. They lived as neighbors to mankind, sometimes generous and sometimes mischievous. They were often the culprits behind various problems, such as illness among livestock, lack of milk in cows, and missing children. However, this was usually due to the fact that the humans had broken one of the fairies' established rules, and it was these cases that required the help of a fairy doctor, someone with a close link to the Fae who was able to mediate between them and humans. These days, the number of people who believed in fairies was limited, and fairy doctors were falling into obscurity. Nevertheless, Lydia, who had inherited her abilities from her mother, had decided to pursue that waning path. That was how she had met Edgar and become the consulting fairy doctor to his earldom. He was the Earl of Ibrazel in name only and lacked the abilities of his ancient predecessors, who had been well versed in fairy magic. In his place, Lydia had dealt with the fairy-related issues that occurred within his territories. Meanwhile, he had fallen in love with her, or so he claimed. He famously enjoyed the company of women, and there used to be no end to the scandals and rumors. Naturally, this made Lydia uneasy, but her only recourse now was to trust that he would be faithful. What relationship had Edgar had with the potential fiancés the tabloids were guessing at? Had he really cut ties with the other women in his life? Lydia pushed the uncertainties of these questions away as she got to her feet. Edgar had yet to return from greeting his guest, and her father had left, saying he had work to get to. Disinclined to study the fashion plates on the table alone, Lydia approached the window for some fresh air just as a grey cat dove in through it. Nico was an old fairy friend of hers, and he appeared with a tabloid in one paw and an announcement that she wished he'd kept to himself. Lydia, the Earl's picking up more and more possible fiancés by the day. There was a whole list of them this time, ordered from most to least likely. It's unfathomable that your name hasn't been mentioned yet. The fairy cat stood on his hind legs. There was a needlessly smug air about the way he set one paw on his hip and looked up at her. Lydia averted her eyes from the newspaper he thrust in her direction and sighed. "Isn't it about time you stopped reading those rags, Nico?" "Excuse me. If you have any doubts about these women, now is the time for you to be interrogating him, not after the wedding. I'm bringing you vital information. There will be no end to it if I interrogate him about every single name. It's nothing more than speculation." Nico thrashed his bushy tail. "What I cannot understand is why these articles are running rampant. Why doesn't the Earl simply announce that it's you? Edgar hasn't decided on an announcement date yet. Why? He isn't dallying with the outfits and the trousseau, that's for sure. The outfits will take some time to tailor. I must say this all sounds very fishy to me, Lydia. Are you sure there isn't a reason the Earl is putting off the announcement?" Nico said, combing his whiskers and looking very much like the cat that got the cream. For example, because he's promised his hand to another woman and he needs to settle things with her before he can tell the world he's going to marry you." As much as Lydia didn't want to believe it, she couldn't discount the possibility. This was Edgar they were talking about. No. I mustn't allow myself to doubt him. I have no other choice but to trust him. Not so, Nico. I still lack the required knowledge and etiquette for my debut in the upper class, so Edgar is postponing the date until I am ready. Besides, Lydia had more pressing concerns to be grappling with. From tomorrow, she would be staying at Maysfield's estate, which was where she would be taught about noble life, etiquette, and customs. However, no matter how much she learned, there was no changing the fact that she was of common birth and upbringing. She wasn't confident that she could ever make for a suitable countess. Anyway, have you seen the eye-watering figure they've reported for the dowry? Nico continued. Lydia glanced at the newspaper in his paw. There was an estimate for the dowry in the prominent headline that made her hang her head. If that was how much it cost to marry a noble, exaggerated or not, the earldom was in for a huge financial hit by taking Lydia as its countess. Human marriages truly are bothersome, aren't they? Maybe you should elope like your father did. There'd be no need for dowries or trousseaux then. Now that Lydia thought of it, perhaps her parents' elopement was just another reason her father was clueless about the wedding preparations. I wouldn't say no. Edgar had returned to the reception room. He wore a bright smile as he approached. However, I do think it would be much nicer to have our loved ones celebrate with us. Wouldn't you agree, Lydia? Yes, she stammered. He was conducting his usual habit of moving far closer to her than she was used to, even now. Has Professor Carlton gone home? Yes. He said he had classes this afternoon. I see. You must be tired. She hesitated. Somewhat. I didn't realize that a wedding could be so much work. Edgar was peering at her from such a close distance that she couldn't help but keep her gaze stuck to the floor. She would feel better able to look at him if only he would take a small step back. You needn't worry about the more bothersome tasks. Just leave everything to me. There was no question that he cherished her. And it wasn't as though she didn't want to marry him. She wanted to be with him, because that was what made her happy. Her own uneasy behavior despite that was making her feel guilty, so she did her best to give him a small smile at the very least. I don't find it the least bit bothersome. It is just that I'm still bewildered because I've never done any of this before. That's really all it is. Yes. I cannot tell you how ecstatic I am, being able to select as many dresses and accessories as my heart desires. However, I lack a sense for what is considered fashionable, least of all among the upper classes. There's no need to think too seriously about it. Anything you choose can easily be altered to your tastes. Lydia nodded and raised her gaze slightly to find a gentle kiss being planted on her cheek. Although I dare say I shall have my own thoughts to share on the subject. Lydia watched the swaying of his glossy blonde bangs as his ash-mauve eyes softened and he showed her a blissful smile. She wondered when exactly he had become capable of such an expression. While he had been fighting for his life in a battle thrust upon him by the cruelty of fate, he had never shown a glimpse of weakness, not even when he joked or smiled. Nothing made Lydia happier than the thought that she could bring about such contentment within him. She hoped that her presence would encourage him to enjoy their peaceful days ahead and gradually shake free from the ruthless and calculating side of his persona. This period was one of preparing for their eternal happiness. What was there to be anxious about? Lydia, I want our preparations to be complete and for us to be married as soon as possible. Yes. When do you think would be a good time for the wedding? In 3 months, perhaps. That ought to give us just enough time. 3 months. Isn't that a little soon? Lydia was still struggling to comprehend the reality of their engagement, and she doubted that a 3-month deadline would assist her in getting her thoughts in order. That isn't enough time for me to learn to be a countess, she said quickly. I still have yet to begin my education on noble etiquette and convention. You can learn all of that after the wedding. Perhaps, but 3 months. What about 6 months? Or a year? Suddenly, Edgar's tone was firm. I cannot wait that long. In fact, Lydia, 3 months might be my limit. He shook his head. Not even that. The truth is that I am exerting a considerable amount of willpower every time I lay eyes on you. Now he had lost her. Getting the sense that it would be in her best interest, Lydia took a small step back as he continued. The Duchess admonished me thusly, a gentleman who truly values his bride must not lay hands on her before the wedding. Of course, she wasn't nearly so blunt or direct about it. Anyway, she's rather straight-laced, don't you think? Though I can certainly understand the moral argument. I wouldn't want you to feel guilt-laden when the time comes to exchange our vows before God. You are an honest and earnest girl, so I'd wager you would find more contentment in remaining pure than in giving yourself over to passion. It is therefore my intention to be as gentlemanly a fiancé as possible, for your sake. But I am sure that I shan't be able to endure it for longer than 3 months. Edgar spoke at length in what seemed to be a single breath, and Lydia was only half sure that she understood him. What she did grasp was that this wasn't something he was able to compromise on, so she could only nod her agreement. He responded with a relieved smile and pulled her into an embrace, but she moved her face out of the way before he could kiss her. Edgar, not when people are watching. What people? He looked around the room. I only see a cat. Nico had taken up position on the sofa and was still absorbed in his tabloid. But at the Earl's utterance, his ears twitched, and he turned around. As I must have told you 1,000 times, I am not a cat. Recently, Edgar had taken to kissing her at every opportunity, regardless of their surroundings. Lydia therefore needed to be careful not to let such an opportunity present itself when there were other people around. With only Nico in the room, she had let her guard down, but his presence was still enough for her to feel embarrassed. You've nothing to worry about, Lydia. How I kiss you in front of others and how I kiss you in private are 2 very different things. She couldn't believe he would say something so outrageous within earshot of Nico. Her panic gave Edgar the opening he needed to give her a rapid peck on the lips. Nico sighed. Lydia blushed. Edgar, I think you could stand to restrain yourself a little more. Never have I restrained myself more before you. And yet you still kissed me. However, Lydia, I hope that my restraint does not give you the impression that my feelings for you are devoid of passion. I can show you to what extent the opposite is true the moment you so wish. No thank you. Though she tried to squirm free, he had her tight in his grasp. If, yes, for example, you also find yourself unable to wait for our wedding night, you have only to leap into my arms without hesitation. But, difficult to admit, isn't it? Then perhaps I shall make it a habit to extend you an invitation to my chambers every night, lest I miss the moment the mood strikes you. Lydia despaired at how casually he was able to spout such impropriety. She never knew whether his words were in jest and he was simply teasing her or whether he was being serious. The embarrassment was getting to be overwhelming. Here I was, relieved that he wouldn't be endlessly trying to seduce you anymore. But now he whines on and on that he cannot wait until the wedding, Nico muttered. Can you blame me? It relates to one of my keenest interests. An interest. Is that all this is? Fear not, Lydia, for I have decided that I shan't flirt with any other woman but you for as long as I live. In other words, she was going to have to put up with this for the rest of her life. You have my condolences, Nico said, vanishing the moment the words were out of his mouth. Lydia had been abandoned. But Edgar, we are only just engaged. I'm not used to being alone with you, and I believe such familiar behavior to be improper given that we have yet to even announce our betrothal, she said in a panic. His arms were still wrapped around her back. Being alone in his presence made her anxious. It meant that she couldn't be too conspicuous in avoiding his stare and that she couldn't deny him kisses. It wasn't that she disliked his embrace or the loving feel of his lips, of course. Rather, she had yet to determine how she ought to respond to his displays of affection. How were lovers supposed to behave toward each other when no one else was present? All of this was new to her, and the thought that she wasn't reacting how Edgar would have liked her to when he held or kissed her made her seize up. She struggled to even look at him directly. Yes, the announcement. We shall hold it immediately after your audience. She blinked. Audience? Am I right in thinking that you will no longer shy away from my kisses once our engagement is common knowledge? Edgar, by audience, you cannot mean. Yes, with Her Majesty, just before your debut. I can't meet the Queen, I'm a commoner. It will never be allowed. I am sure I shall be able to sort something out. Edgar smiled warmly even as Lydia backed away in a hurry. When he promised to make something happen, it happened, no matter what underhanded means he had to employ. Lydia shook her head emphatically. You don't need to go to such lengths for us to be married, surely. Even with her wealthy, bourgeois father, the upper classes treated her like she was nothing more than a merchant's daughter. She shuddered to think how she might be vilified if she met the Queen. Your father graduated from Cambridge and teaches at the University of London. He might not be of the gentry in a technical sense, but he ought to be regarded as such in a professional capacity. Perhaps, if he were a bishop or a barrister. Her father's profession might just about put him at the same level of social standing, but it was such a stretch that it seemed to her even more audacious to expect an audience with the Queen. Would you truly find it so shameful to announce your engagement to me before my debut? Lydia asked. Edgar's brow furrowed. In that case, perhaps you ought to find yourself a wife among the aristocracy instead, she went on, knowing as she spoke that she was being utterly unreasonable. Unable to bear things any longer, she rushed from the room. It had been one Lord Constable who had marched most indignantly into the Ashenbert estate about half an hour earlier. Despite having shown up without announcing himself, he had shouted at the butler to summon Edgar as though he were the one being slighted. Tompkins hadn't had a choice but to interrupt the Earl during his meeting with his fiancée and her father. Knowing how much influence Constable had in political circles, Edgar had chosen to see him rather than turn him away. I must insist that you take responsibility were the first words out of his mouth. Regarding what matter precisely? I shan't be told that you have forgotten that you seduced my daughter. I was quite unaware that you had a daughter. Constable's face turned a bright red, an apparent mixture of rage and embarrassment. Lucinda is a pure-hearted girl, and she is currently preparing for her debut this year. You have shamelessly taken advantage of her naivety, and I certainly hope you do not expect your show of ignorance to release you from all culpability. The man thrust a book in Edgar's direction. The cover was bordered with ribbon, identifying it as a diary belonging to a young girl. He confirmed as much verbally. She has written about the love letters you sent her and the occasion on which you came to see her in secret. Is it not a breach of privacy to read your daughter's diary without permission? I am her father. It is my duty to know everything regarding her. In any case, I have never once sent correspondence to your daughter, Edgar said with confidence. Nowhere did his power of memory excel more than in his dealings with women. If you are upset that your daughter has been made impure before her debut, I suggest you confirm the details with her before casting aspersions. Impure? You mean to say it went further than a kiss? Edgar stared at the man blankly. He hadn't realized that what they were discussing was so trivial. You would ask a gentleman to take responsibility for a mere kiss. In that case, I must have at least 14 different women whom I am obligated to marry before your daughter. The comment had half been in jest, but Constable looked even more enraged than when he'd arrived. It was in that state that he went home again. My lord, I believe that 14 is a rather modest estimate, Edgar's servant said on his return after seeing Constable out. Do you really? Insofar as I am aware. You may keep that knowledge to yourself, Raven. And I would especially ask that you not share it with Lydia. I shan't under any circumstances, Raven replied, his tone unusually firm. It must have been born of the anxiety he doubtlessly felt every time he witnessed his master upsetting Lydia. Depression turned to disgruntlement as Edgar recalled his unpleasant guest, and an enraged Lydia left him alone in the smaller reception room. He had no knowledge of what Constable was accusing him of, so it didn't matter how the man vented his anger. He and his daughter would be the ones to lose face. Edgar couldn't foresee it becoming a problem. That was, as long as Lydia didn't find out about it. While she didn't seem to be having doubts, she was rather sensitive at the moment, and the last thing he wanted was for her to suffer unnecessary anxiety about the wedding. In that sense, the matter became one he would need to navigate carefully. It wasn't, however, the most pressing matter afoot. Perhaps I really won't be able to convince her to see Her Majesty. Lydia was as stubborn and inflexible as ever. Edgar had thought that she would become more trusting of him in his capacity as her fiancé as he worked through the wedding preparations. Though she was still awkward when it came to receiving his affections, he had expected her to thaw, little by little, and for their hearts to grow attuned and ready for the ceremony. The reality was very different. Things were becoming more complicated from one moment to the next. He didn't doubt that an audience with the Queen would be a heavy burden for Lydia to bear. The reason he wanted to insist was because of the inherent significance of Lydia debuting in high society as Professor Carlton's daughter. It would be meaningless for her to have such an audience after becoming a countess. A woman who just so happened to marry into nobility was not viewed as equal to a woman who was born worthy of her title. He wanted Lydia to have a place in his circles without encountering hostility there, and now was the time to make it happen. "Miss Carlton has gone home, my lord," Raven remarked as he entered the room. The boy rarely showed emotion, his expression generally impassive, but his apprehension was all too clear to Edgar. "She has." The idea of an audience with Her Majesty upset her. Though Raven's expression didn't so much as twitch, Edgar suspected the news had discouraged him. "How do you suppose I might persuade her, Raven?" "I don't suppose that you can," he said plainly. He never had known how to soften the blow. "Oh. Miss Carlton's opinions do not change all that easily." On that point, the servant was absolutely correct. If Edgar stuck to his guns about the audience, she would likely be even more convinced that he was overly concerned with appearances. "My lord, I ask that you try not to upset Miss Carlton too much." Raven's face was grave. It seemed he feared that Lydia might change her mind about the wedding completely. Edgar was confident that Raven was just as happy about the upcoming union as he himself was. Should things fall through, the boy might come to resent him. Never had Raven rebelled or interfered in Edgar's business, but it seemed he was so eager for the wedding to come to fruition that he was prepared to at least state his opinion. "I simply wish to do as much as possible before any unpleasant happenings," Edgar said. "I want to give her everything I can." Edgar had a powerful enemy. He had sought the title of Earl of Ibrazel in order to protect himself from that enemy, and it was during that time that he and Lydia had met. Her abilities as a fairy doctor had saved him then. He had determinedly kept her by his side to fight against the hostile organization, which was capable of commanding the Unseelie court. And over the course of their time together, he had fallen deeply in love with her. Presently, and no matter what should happen, he wanted her to stay with him, not for her abilities but because of who she was. For her kindness and the peace he felt when she was by his side. The leader of the society that had killed his family and tormented him for many years, was dead. His memories, however, which were linked to the core of the organization, remained. They had survived because Edgar had taken them in. Edgar had become the society's leader, the prince. He had no idea what would happen now, whether the curse that had given birth to the prince would alter him or whether he would act as a seal for those memories and be able to remain himself. In any case, he found himself unable to let go of his hope of a future, including his marriage to Lydia, and he had therefore continued with the wedding preparations without being able to disclose the truth to her. He would marry her and give her everything that was in his power to do so. That ought to protect her, he reasoned, and it was why he was in such a hurry. And a place in aristocratic society was among the things he felt he could give her. There shouldn't be any unpleasant happenings. From this point forward, your lordship will be able to live a peaceful life alongside Miss Carlton. Raven was the only one who knew the full details of what had happened. His matter-of-fact assertion gave Edgar courage. "Yes, you're right. Regardless, I shall be sure to pacify her. I do not think she would appreciate it if you were to express too much keenness." The intricacies of emotion eluded Raven, and he spoke even his harshest opinions as plainly as he thought them. "I know," Edgar said after a pause. Lydia no longer reacted with anger when he touched or kissed her, so he would have liked to think that their relationship had progressed. Why, then, did she seem less receptive than ever when the two of them were alone together? Though Edgar felt his spirits starting to fall again, he didn't have the time to think things through at length. His butler had come to announce the arrival of another visitor. "My lord, there is a young woman here to see you. Shall I tell her you are absent?" Tompkins asked calmly. Recently, the estate had seen the odd lady caller. No doubt they came seeking the truth regarding the recent rumors about the Earl's betrothal. He had never done more than flirt with any of these women, but he wasn't confident that he would be able to resist thoroughly seducing them when they were present and interested. He was therefore refusing to see them. Tompkins, Edgar's talented butler, was someone else who was looking forward to seeing Lydia become his wife. He was being careful not to lead his master into temptation and was already eager to see this latest visitor away. "Yes, please do," Edgar said. Tompkins therefore seemed puzzled when he was stopped again. "Did you happen to ask her name, Tompkins?" Edgar knew that his butler would not have forgotten to pass on the visitor's name. Rather, he must have judged that the information was best kept to himself. The Earl trusted Tompkins enough that he wouldn't have felt the need to ask but for the calling card in the stout man's grasp. It had the same pink ribbon border as the diary that Constable had brought with him. "It is Lady Lucinda, daughter of Lord Constable." It was just as Edgar had expected. Had she perhaps come to explain her father's misapprehensions? What sort of girl was she, anyway? The Earl found his curiosity piqued. "Show her through to the drawing room." "Is that wise, my lord?" "She came wishing to discuss something with me, did she not?" "I have no intention of being unfaithful to Lydia, Tompkins." Lucinda was a fair-skinned girl with black hair that had been tied back. She had company in the form of a young, red-haired maid, and she seemed to have been waiting for the Earl somewhat restlessly. "A pleasure to make your acquaintance, Lady Lucinda." She jumped to her feet like a tightly wound spring. "Good afternoon, Lord Ashenbert." She paused. "I do beg your pardon, but this is not the first time we have met. I wonder if your lordship recalls Her Grace's New Year concert?" Now that Edgar studied her face, he realized that he did recognize her. She was a rather beautiful young woman. However, he couldn't recall having exchanged more than a few words with her. "Forgive me. I spoke to quite a number of women at the Duchess's party. I am sure I would have remembered your name had I heard it, however." Neither of them had been introduced to one another. It was why he hadn't been aware that Constable had a daughter. Lucinda, looking rather bewildered, approached Edgar and clasped her hands together pleadingly. "I'm sorry. I can only imagine how angry you must be. I haven't forgotten our promise, and yet I came to see you anyway. But father saw my diary, and, well, I had written about your lordship." Though things were taking a turn for the worse, Edgar remained calm in his response. "Your father called to discuss the matter of your diary. I must confess I could make neither heads nor tails of it. I am not well acquainted with you, nor do I recall making any promises. As I explained to Lord Constable, I have no recollection of exchanging letters with you either. Your lordship has come to despise me. That's it, isn't it? I suppose your proposal was not in earnest either." "I'm sorry. I am already betrothed." "Impossible. Does your lordship mean to say that I am not the fiancé you have been waiting to name?" Lucinda buried her face in her hands and started to sob. Bewildered, Edgar tried to pacify her and offered her a seat. He was patient in drawing out information from her and eventually learned that she truly believed she had been exchanging letters with Lord Ashenbert. The first letter had arrived without warning. The sender had apparently become enamored with her at first sight at that party in London and had sought her name in order to send her a love letter. It had been signed only with the gentleman's initials, which were the same as Edgar's, so Lucinda had been sure it had come from him. The pair had been in correspondence ever since. "My maid had been receiving his lordship's letters and sending my responses at the assigned location. He said he wanted to keep our correspondence a secret for the time being." "I suppose you are the maid in question?" Edgar looked at the girl Lucinda had brought with her, who gave a modest nod. "Where were the letters sent?" The maid remained silent. "Annie hasn't been able to say a word since birth. She cannot speak, but she can make simple intentions known with hand gestures. I had her take me to where she was delivering the letters," Lucinda said. Annie had been taking and receiving the letters at a pub until one day they had come to a sudden halt. The establishment was in the same town where Lucinda lived, on the outskirts of London, and when she had asked the staff, all she had found was that the letters had been picked up by someone who looked like a servant. She had promised the Earl that she wouldn't send any letters directly to his estate, so she had been able to do nothing since then but fret. Personally, Edgar could see no reason for a man to keep such a relationship secret unless he was planning to eventually break things off without creating further trouble for himself. It was pure folly to trust a man like that. "I was under the impression you had met this gentleman," said the Earl. After all, according to Constable and the diary, the pair had kissed. "Yes, once, under the cover of night." Apparently, the mysterious man had snuck into the garden of her estate in the dead of night and called to her where she sat beside her window. In truth, Lucinda knew nothing of her lover, including his appearance, and had assumed him to be Edgar the entire time. Although the Earl struggled to contain his sigh, he managed to remain courteous. "While it pains me to be the bearer of bad news, I am not the gentleman you have been corresponding with. There is a strong possibility that you have been deceived." Lucinda's face turned pale. "Deceived? Does that mean I kissed a stranger?" She trembled, shaking her head as if to deny it while clutching her handkerchief. "I shan't believe it. When we first met, some girls I am acquainted with were speaking ill of me because of my mother's station. I was so upset that I couldn't bear it, and I ran from my seat only to almost collide with your lordship. You spoke so kindly to me then that I fell in love with you." Now that he was reminded of it, Edgar did have the sense that he had consoled this girl after she was spoken badly of. He also recalled rumors that Constable's first wife had been his younger sister's governess. The governess in question must have been Lucinda's mother. "I beg you tell me the truth, my lord. What was it about me that you found so distasteful?" Edgar had no sympathy for her. Not at their first meeting or now. "If you do not believe me, you are welcome to compare my handwriting to that from the letters. I no longer have any of the letters. I was instructed to burn them and dispose of the ashes each time so that our relationship would not be discovered. Only what I recorded in my diary remains, and those entries lack much detail." The gentleman truly was meticulous, asking her to burn the letters as though they contained classified information. Meanwhile, Lucinda was happily writing about them in her diary, which her father had gone on to read. "In any case, if you are adamant that I am the man you have been corresponding with, our only option is to make this public and seek judgment from an impartial party. Any further discussion will only prove fruitless." "No. Nobody must know." She was a young woman from a well-to-do family. For her to have met a gentleman in secret was simply scandalous, so it was no wonder she would rather the matter be kept private. Anxiety hardened her features, and she got to her feet without warning. "I understand so very clearly, my lord. My heart will remain broken whether you are speaking the truth or not. There is nothing left to be said." Lucinda lowered her gaze as if holding back tears before turning on her heel. There was a pause, as if she was waiting for Edgar to stop her, but he did not. "Farewell, Lord Ashenbert. I wish you and your fiancé all the best," she murmured, sounding for all the world like she really was breaking up with a lover. Then, she hurried away. Goodness me. Edgar stood by the window, exasperated. "That's all very well for her, but I doubt she will be endeavoring to clear me of these false allegations. It was quite the affront." "Might there be trouble ahead, my lord?" asked Raven, who had been watching over the proceedings quietly. He was concerned about Lydia catching wind of the whole thing and inevitably assuming that Edgar had indeed seduced Lucinda. "I am entirely innocent. There is to be no trouble. This young lady has simply jumped to conclusions. But this talk of secret letters and sneaking around at night is all very familiar." Raven's unusually sharp memory could be quite the nuisance. Edgar grimaced. "That was a long time ago. In America, no less, and I was simply relieving a married woman's boredom. Anyway, on this occasion, I am guiltless. There is nothing for you to worry about." Lucinda might have wanted to believe that she had been corresponding with Edgar, but she seemed to have accepted that he was engaged. Perhaps optimistically, he doubted he would be seeing her again.